My last video, I talked about the Baltimore Ravens and kind of their really good history, or their perceived really good history when it comes to the NFL draft. Another organization that over the years has done some really good work in the NFL draft is the Pittsburgh Steelers. And that's why you've seen for so many years they would kind of always seem to stick around, always be in the mix. That's why Mike Tomlin's never had a losing season as a head coach. You can say, well, that's because he's a really good coach. He's a really good motivator. He's really good in terms of getting the best out of his players. Not the best X's and O's guys. It sure doesn't feel that way. But it's a lot easier to do when you continue to reinforce the roster with really good talent. And it's an important draft for the Pittsburgh Steelers because priority one is the need to build around their young quarterback, Kenny Pickett. And, when you look at the history of the Steelers, they've had a lot of successful, first-round picks, so they needed to make sure they really hit on one here. And in terms of helping Kenny Pickett, protecting Kenny Pickett, they had some work to do in this draft. Specifically, when you think about protection, the offensive line was a top need for this team. I think a lot of Steelers fans would point to that and tell you that. And the best way to protect your young quarterback and help your young quarterback is to help him by protecting him by improving that offensive line. The Steelers were also in a good spot here because they were picking in the middle of round one. You could sit there and see a situation where a top 10 talent could fall down a little bit. And if you want to really go after him, you can move up and it doesn't cost you a ton. They had 2 second-round picks, including pick 32, which is incredibly valuable from that Chase Claypool trade. So basically the Steelers took Chase Claypool, who was, for all intents and purposes, their wide receiver 3 that probably didn't fit into their long-term plans, who had been overall a bit disappointing, I think you could say, and flipped him into pick 32 here. So, be able to in that spot, mid-round 1 pick, top of round 2, middle of round 2, good spot to be in. Sometimes it makes sense that aforementioned kind of hey, a top 10 type talent sometimes will drop out of the top 10. And if you see him and you really like him, it makes sense to make a small move up to get him. It made sense to me 1,000% for the Steelers to do that here with Broderick Jones. I thought he was the best left tackle prospect in this draft. Actually, quite a bit of a distinction between Broderick Jones and freaking Paris Johnson Jr. and certainly Peter Skoronski. Giving up a 4th-round pick to move up 3 spots to ensure you get your blindside protector for Kenny Pickett for the next 10 years, you should do that all of the fucking time. That is not an onerous trade. That's not panicking. That's making sure you get your guy. Giving up a 4th-round pick to do that, that's a cost of doing business. You fucking do it. And if you don't, you're kind of dumb. You might say, well, I wouldn't have taken Broderick Jones if I was going to make the trade up. Okay, fine. That's your prerogative. But I love the approach here for the Steelers on day 1. I gave them a B+ for going up a little bit to ensure they got their guy, but they got the best left tackle in the draft, in my opinion, at pick 14. Only had to give up a 4th-round pick to do so, with the approach of, the biggest need was to be able to protect Kenny Pickett, and they addressed that with their 1st-round pick. So it was really good work. I thought day 2 was also a home run for the Steelers this year. I know Joey Porter Jr. might hit the sentimental notes for the fan base. He's going to play with the team that his daddy was a star for. But the reality is that Porter was a borderline 1st-round talent. It really fits a need here. And I know some Steelers fans could look at this and say, well, this is one position the Steelers haven't always, we talk about some of the good things they've done in the draft over the years, but one of the things they haven't done so well in the draft over the years is evaluation of secondary talent and selecting the right secondary players for them. But I think Joey Porter Jr. is certainly talented enough to be able to kind of buck that trend. I really like him here. Keaanu Benton just screamed to me Steelers defensive line. He was a solid value. His best football's ahead of him. Frankly, I'm a little pissed that he wasn't there for the Bears at 53. I would have loved to have had him in Chicago. I like his fit in Pittsburgh quite a bit, especially for a team that could use some young depth on the defensive line. And I thought Darnell Washington was a full-on steal in round 3. To me, he was a back end of round 1 type of talent in this draft. Elite blocker from day 1, and he's got upside as a receiver. If Georgia didn't have Brock Bowers there, Darnell Washington probably would have seen a little less of him as a blocker because they would have used him more as a receiver. They were able to also trade down 13 spots to still get him. So they pick up a 4th-rounder to boot to still take Darnell Washington, who is a borderline end of round 1 type of talent in this draft class. If his knee holds up, which apparently was a concern here, the Steelers got a frickin' steal here. Worst case scenario, you've got a guy that's going to improve your run game from day one because he's like having a sixth offensive lineman on the field. Darnell Washington comes into the NFL, and he's already an elite blocker for the tight end position. So I gave the Steelers an A for day two. I thought this was outstanding. Hit some of the key notes, replenish some of the depth on the defense. Darnell Washington, massive steal from my perspective. I thought day three brought a little more value for the Steelers. Nick Herbig shouldn't have been able to get there to where the Steelers were in round four, and somehow he was. I think he's got some long-term starter potential. Could see him contribute as a situational edge rusher in 2023. In terms of round 7 picks, Cory Trice Jr. is a fantastic kind of size speed prospect in the secondary. In round 7, those type of guys you take a flyer on, worst case scenario, they might be able to contribute and become, good contributors in terms of special teams and like back of the roster type of guys. I think Spencer Anderson's likely more of a practice squad candidate in 2023. Not likely to hear much out of him. So solid work on day 3, especially with the Herbig pick. I gave him a C. They didn't have a ton of picks, but solid work there. I think, again, to kind of recap this draft for the Pittsburgh Steelers, most knew that they needed and probably wanted to address the offensive line. Broderick Jones did that. Joey Porter was a logical pick for a number of reasons here, and the least of which is just the family name. Like, he's going to get to play on the same team as Daddy did. That'll be a big media and fan story, but it's so much more than that. Keaanu Benton adds upside and youth that was needed to that defensive front. Like I said, Darnell Washington could be a tight end 2 now, and who knows, he could be a long-term tight end 1. But worst case scenario, he brings you huge impact as a blocker in the running game and some upside as a receiver. So bringing him into the lineup doesn't telegraph that you're likely going to run. Nick Herbig is at worst a high-end backup, but I think he does have some certain starter potential. Overall, I would look at this Steelers draft class. I would put their first 5 picks up against basically anybody in this year's draft. Any of the other 31 teams. The first 5 picks of the Steelers, I would put up against anybody. Talk about long-term left tackle, long-term CB1, long-term starter at defensive line in Keanu Benton, potential long-term starter in Darnell Washington. You say, well, what about Freiermuth? Okay, fair enough, but long-term contributor for sure. Herbig could be a long-term starter there. I look at where they got these guys, the value, how they executed this draft, trading up small when appropriate to make sure they get their guy, being able to trade back quite a bit to be able to still get a guy that represents a huge steal. This is a really good draft for the Steelers. I thought they were one of the biggest winners on draft weekend. I gave them an overall grade of B, and you're going to say, wow, only a B. A grade should be reserved for exceptional, outstanding, but this was certainly above average. This is really damn good, especially when you look at the first 2 days of this draft. This is a really good effort to me by General Manager Omar Khan. I really like what the Steelers did this year.